Okay, welcome everybody to the last edition for this year of the Confronting Hegemonic Ideas in Counseling Psychology speaker series. Oops. Okay, the purpose of the series is to increase awareness of heterodox viewpoints and inconvenient facts and findings that do not necessarily conform to hegemonic narratives and dominant perspectives in counseling psychology, in order to promote critical thinking, intellectually rigorous research, and the ability to serve a broader range of counseling and psychotherapy clients. One of the impetus for this speaker series was information collected by Heterodox Academy on a nationally representative sample of American post-secondary students. And it showed that there is quite substantial reluctance to discuss controversial ideas, and students hold back for a number of reasons, such as, being criticized for being offensive, having peers make critical comments, having a harassment complaint. But the point is that students are oftentimes holding back, and according to their representative sample, 88% of the students believe that universities should encourage students and professors to interact respectfully with people whose beliefs differ from their own. But 63% did not agree that their climate on their campus prevented people from honestly expressing their beliefs and opinions. So the counseling psychology program at the University of British Columbia supports the free exchange of ideas and respectful open debate, consistent with the Canadian Code of Ethics for Psychologists and the Canadian Code of Ethics of the Canadian Counseling and Psychotherapy Association. We also want to let you know that the views expressed by the speakers are their own, and no endorsement by the counseling psychology program of their views is offered or implied. The guests are speakers of UBC, and if you are in strong disagreement, you have the opportunity to make comments and ask questions, but it's also an opportunity to model intellectual and cultural humility and respectful engagement with speakers who present heterodox or unconventional scholarly and evidence-based research perspectives. Again, I'm not going to go through the ethical codes there, but we do believe that this is the most ethical thing to do, is to invite speakers to speak on topics that we may disagree with. Particularly for our students in our program, we believe that preparing you to be a versatile mental health professional or researcher and maximizing your ability to serve a wide range of clients who differ greatly from you requires exposure to and making sense of ideas and evidence that can threaten your belief system. It also requires you to practice the person-centered conditions of empathy, unconditional positive regard, and genuineness, as well as intellectual and cultural humility. Over the course of the speaker series, today's talk, previous talks, if you watch them online, you may encounter information or opinions that you may find uncomfortable or disturbing, or that challenge common knowledge, sacred ideas, or disputable fact. On the other hand, some people may feel validated and invigorated because they now realize they're not the only ones that think this way. So we do expect a range of responses to all of our speakers, including our speaker today. Lastly, and I'm not going to go through this in detail, but another impetus for this speaker series was some research by Johnson and Peacock called Breaking the Bubble, Recent Graduate Experience with Ideological Diversity. In summary, they found that when their graduates went off into the world of work, they were surprised at how unprepared they were to work with individuals of different degrees, economically, politically, ideologically, from them in their social circles. And acknowledging this, they conveyed uneasiness, internal strife, and at times guilt. They recognized incongruence with their values of being civilly engaged, yet maintaining larger homogeneous ideological networks. And I'm just going to read off some of the quotations from the students in that study. Sarah from that study said, "Sometimes turning on Fox News or reading different articles from different places, and although you may vehemently disagree with it or think that's not true in any way, or whatever you may think about it, it's still important to read those things and interpret those things. Understand where people who have different views are coming from. Understand what their arguments are. I think that could not only help you empathize and understand those things, but also in terms of if you were having a disagreement with somebody, also helps you understand where they're coming from." Another quote from a student in that study: "I started running into people that had opposite views than me, and I was not necessarily prepared to have those conversations. It's easy to have productive conversations with people that have similar views to you, but it's very hard to have those same productive conversations when people do not have the same views as you. Another quote from Stephanie from that research study: I think university, for the most part, maybe a few times in university, but for the most part in general, didn't necessarily prepare me for real conversations about ideological differences. So with that said, today's speaker is Dr. Shulamit Kahn from Boston University. And I'm just going to read out her biography here. Dr. Kahn is an associate professor at Boston University's Questrom School of Business and previously taught at the University of California, Irvine. She received her PhD from MIT in economics and was the first economist to publish evidence of gender discrimination in economics. She is an expert on women in STEM and has extensively published on this topic in American Economic Review, Oxford Handbook, Science Frontiers in Psychology, Psychological Perspectives in the Public Interest, Academic Medicine, Journal of Economic Perspectives, Nature Biotech, as well as many other journals. She has spoken to many audiences on women in STEM and in economics, particularly including the Princeton Institute of Advanced Science, the World Bank, and the European Gender Summit, and the Chinese World Economics. Her other recent research focuses on immigration versus emigration of foreign students with advanced STEM degrees. She teaches problem saying it though. Econometrics, how do you say it?
Yes.
Econometrics and data analysis for business. In her spare time, Dr. Kahn serves as board chair of a nonprofit vocational program and school in Kenya, and amuses her 4-year-old grandson. Oopsies. And I'm just going to put up one more. Oops, I just need to share one thing here. Go. Okay, so without further ado, I would like to turn it over to our welcome speaker here, with the talk title being Exploring Gender Bias in 6 Key Domains of Science and Adversarial Collaboration. So thank you, Dr. Kahn, for being here today, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much, Rob. Before I start on my slides, I want to not only thank you, Rob, but I'm really happy to be here because it's an unusual kind of a talk to give, which is, an unusual venue, and the idea is unusual. So I'll be talking about the research that we just published 5 weeks ago, actually. I published with Stephen Ceci and Wendy Williams called Exploring Gender Bias in 6 Key Domains and Adversarial Collaboration. It's made quite a splash, including an editorial in Wall Street Journal. It's been downloaded or viewed 22,000 times in these 5 weeks, which is very cool to me. Before I start with my slides and tell you about the article, let me just say, why is this an adversarial collaboration? So Steve, Ceci, and Wendy, as psychologists at Cornell, because many of you are psychologists, you will know, especially Steve, I'm an economist. Steve could not give the talk. He's got family-related responsibilities, but I'm really happy to be here. In what ways are we adversarial? Steve and Wendy have written a number of studies that have not found that there is no gender bias in academia. So they wrote one in 2011. Both of these are in PNAS. The 2011 is called Understanding Current Causes of Women's Underrepresentation of Science. And in 2015, their experimental audit study on tenure-track hiring in academia, which both of them found no gender bias. I've been writing for decades, as Rob said, about gender bias, particularly in economics academia, sometimes with my co-author, Donna Ginther. And, I'm dating myself. My first article on this topic was in 1993, before some of you were born, no doubt. How did we meet each other? It's kind of by chance. Wendy and I and Donna had the same NIH grant, so we were at a conference together and they got to know us. And then when they wanted to write their first article, the thing that turned into our joint 2014 paper about women in academic science, they floated the idea to PSBI, who said, well, you need somebody on the other side, somebody who believes that there is gender bias, at least sometimes. And so they thought of us and called us, and I'm very glad they did. It's a lot of fun to work with them. Okay, so now I am going to start right on by sharing my screen. Can you see the screen? Yes, great. Okay, so that's our story. That's the name. So why did we do this article? Well, this is really where we started from. Since we published about women in science, we get to review a lot of articles. And by saying a lot, there are a lot of articles out there to review. These are the number of articles listed in the Web of Science each year, it's not cumulative, each year, about women in STEM academia. So we did the search underneath it, and this is only STEM academia. As you see, they're just more and more and more every year, thousands now per year. And if we had added in women in STEM more generally, or if we had added in academia more generally, there would have been, thousands more. So, and the problem that each of us, the three authors, saw separately is that despite this huge literature, much of the articles start by quoting the same old, literally old articles. So this is just a quote from one article, but there's many more like this, which seems to be de rigueur in most of those thousands of articles about women in academic science. Currently, evidence in a number of quantitative, qualitative, empirical, and experience is mounting, indicating that gender bias is not only present in academia, but also an important factor contributing to the gender gap. And you look at the quotes and you say, the earliest is 1999, the latest is 2015, and many of them are early in that period. And if you know about these articles, I'll mention some of these articles later on in my talk, they are either not about tenure-track academia, or as you can see, they're old. And yet they're still the ones that are being cited. So why is our article heterodox? Why did Rob think it was heterodox? Because we actually did careful searches of the literature, looking for the empirical evidence of whether there is or is not gender bias. We reference in our article 400 articles, books, whatever, but we have read at least 10 times that much. And we have looked at the abstracts and titles of many, many more than that, because as you see, there are many articles on these. One of the things that we notice is that very few people who write articles about this topic, probably as well as other topics, do not do a very careful search. So that makes us different. As I said, they tend to cite the same articles over and over again. And there seems to be a lot of confirmation bias, as I'll talk about in a second. So the citations here, especially in the paper introductions, really seem to reveal to me the author's own bias. The good thing about me as Steve and Wendy is that we didn't necessarily have the same bias to begin with, so that's good. Although we can't say definitively, I did want to do an analysis of all the tens of thousands of articles in terms of what they cite. I didn't do that, but here's an example of what we did do. We looked at all the articles on faculty hiring, and I looked at the citations on these specific articles. So here are 4 articles that we talk about in our paper. Which one is really cited a lot? So these are Web of Science citations from 2010 to 2020. Which one is the most cited? Moss and Ricusen in 2012. That's not about tenure-track hiring. That's about faculty hiring students. And later in this paper, I will tell you why that's not the same as tenure-track hiring. Nevertheless, it's cited as the example when you're talking about when people want to write about tenure-track hiring. And the other paper that's and this one finds bias against women. This one also finds bias against women. This is the 1999 article. There was bias against women in hiring in 1999. Is there in 2023 or even 2020, which is the end of the data that we cover? In contrast, these two are about hiring. It includes one of my my co-authors' articles, and they're they're much less cited. So that's an example. Another example here is about grants. The blue grants are about the Swedish grants, the Swedish grant program. And one of the more highly cited ones is a 1997 article by Wennerus and Wold, which is this dark line. Somebody else studied the same agency and grants in the same agency 10 years later, and that's the dashed line. Wennerus and Wold found bias. This, Sandstrom and Houston found no bias. So there was a lot of progress, assuming they were both accurate, there was a lot of progress in that period. What gets cited as evidence of what it looks like today is, of course, the old one. And the same thing like this, Boardman, Marsh, and several other people did a meta-study about grants, which they first published in 2007. Then they realized that they hadn't controlled for enough moderators, so they redid it, and they published it, a similar article in 2009. Which one shows gender bias? The earlier one. Which one is cited more? The earlier one, not the corrected version. So that's the kind of, I think, bias in citation we see. How did we avoid bias? Because we could be biased too, is we really tried to stick to very standard good analysis methods. We looked to search for the keywords, we searched references from the articles we identify, etc. We looked for cases that had the evidence and the data. We did not look at the summary or conclusions of the papers, because that's not necessarily the facts. We're looking for the facts for the data. And also there were a few times that, you know, it's a good thing that we looked carefully at the data analysis. My specific bugaboo is that people do not understand interaction terms in regressions, or they choose. So there's this one article that talked about one interaction terms with gender, but there were two interaction terms and the direct effect, and they just ignored that. So that's why you have to look at the data analysis. So here are the 6 topics that we looked at. We also have a section on publications, which I'm not going to talk about here, but we're going to do it in order. So the first thing we're going to talk about is tenure-track hiring. What did we find? So we're looking at all the articles on tenure-track hiring. A lot of the articles that just say there is bias say, well, look at the percentage female among PhDs and look at the percentage female among assistant professors. So the top 2 lines refer to those 2 things. LPS is something we used in our earlier article. Life sciences, psychology, and social sciences, the less mathematical ones. And if you look at the contemporaneous percentage female, it seems like there's a very large gap between the percentage female among PhDs and among assistant professors. Really no gap, interestingly, in the more math-intensive fields. They seem to track each other very well, but this is contemporaneous. This is what happens when you follow the cohort through. These 2 are much more closely together, which is to say, part of what you were seeing is the fact that the growth in PhDs is so quick that it takes a while for the assistant professors who come 6-7 years after, they start they graduate, some of them. That's what's happening here. That's why, and that's why this is different than the previous picture. Nevertheless, you have to look at this and say there are fewer assistant professors who are women than in percentage-wise in these non-mathematical fields. Not so much worrying about the mathematical ones. In fact, In math, it seems the opposite. There are more assistant professors, and sometimes then there are PhDs in terms of the percentage female. But this is a problem. The question is, what is the problem? Is it the problem that women are not being hired? Or is it the problem that women are not applying for these jobs? So we looked for evidence. We just didn't stop at the percentage female in the groups. We looked for evidence of hiring searches, of actual searches. And here's an example, and what I think is probably the best example of that. This is done actually in 2010 by the National Research Council. People actually answer surveys when they ask. So this is from 545 different searches for tenure-track jobs. And it covers the fields of biology, several different kinds of fields here, all in math related. It looks at the doctoral pool before these searches, the things feeding into these searches. It looked at the percentage female among the PhDs versus the percentage females among the applicants, those interviewed and those offered jobs. The huge drop that you see, I'm just pointing out biology, but it's true in all of them, is between how many women graduate with PhDs and how many women apply for tenure-track jobs. Women are not applying. I will talk about this more later. But this is where we're losing women. It is not in the hiring process. It is not in the search committees. This is where we lose the women. The women choose not to hire. Is it a problem? I mean, not to apply. Is it a problem? Absolutely. We'll talk about that later. Once they apply, they are more likely to get an interview and they are more likely to get a job offer. And this is true, like just highlighting biology all the way down. It's true. It's really true for electrical engineering, who's just kind of saying, oh, I want to give women jobs because we have no women. This might be affirmative action or saying we want to get more women, but that's what it was in 2010. And we have cases, we found other university search committee data, we talk about it in our article, which finds similar things to this. Another kind of study you might see, or you do see, the one that my co-authors themselves, were these experiments about hypothetical hiring into tenure-track jobs. There were really only 4 studies that were about, that asked faculty, would you hire this tenure-track person? The Moss-Racusin side asked, would you hire this undergraduate to head your lab? But this is about hiring searches for tenure and entry-level tenure-track. And what all of these did is they showed CVs to faculty current faculty and asked, would you hire these people? And then they randomly changed the names from women to men. That's what the 1999 Stein Price et al. Did in psychology. And they found there was a bias towards men, that men were doing better. It was in the US. And that evidence I fully believe. But by 2015, when my co-authors wrote, they found no evidence of bias against women. And in fact, they found a little bias towards women, more likely to hire women, which is what you saw in my previous slide, except for economics. And economics, unfortunately, which is why I'm so concerned about it, is an outlier in a lot of cases. I'll mention economics because it's near and dear to my heart, but several times here. Terry et al., a similarly sized study, also found a bias towards women and non-binary gender. And another one in 2021 for Nordic countries, the other ones were in the US, also found a bias towards women. So all of this evidence together says the problem is not that women who apply for tenure-track jobs are not being hired. So the second thing we looked at was a research grant proposal. So people say, okay, research or not, research or not. If you're a woman and you want to get a grant and you apply for a grant, you are less likely to get it than a man. Now, ideally, we would like to be able to, like with the CV, show identical grants and see if people make different choices. We found only one randomized experiment who did it, which is a good one. It did it for NIH, who was very nice to say, okay, for the first round evaluations, we will give you, we'll participate in this experiment where we fake the names, and one's a female name and one's a male name. This found no gender difference. Size 412, exactly the same research proposals, no gender differences. But that's the only study there is. There's a lot written, though, about gender in grant success. So in our we did a meta-analysis of it, and what we asked is not, we'd like to know whether equivalent men and women got their grants, but we're never going to know that necessarily, because most of the studies do not, give us enough information about what the publication, what the proposals were about, and what, what the previous record of the proposer was. So instead, we wanted to ask a very simple question. What is the success rate? If we can get data by gender of applications and data by gender of awards, we can just compare the success rates. Now, it might be biased. We understand. But if we find a gender difference, if anything, women had a worse record because they have had fewer grants. If anything, they had fewer publications. So the bias would be for not to find that women were worse off, we're worse off even if it was fair. But if we find a difference, it could just be because of the track record. But if we find no difference, that's real prima facie evidence that there's not bias, we believe, because the women have a worse record to begin with. Okay, so I am now getting for a second. Okay, there we go. So there's the search that we had, what we did, have to look, but these are the terms that we looked at, and we only found actually 39 studies. However, there were quite a few grant applications covered in this, because if many articles did not have application data, but if they talked about having had application data from the site of an agency, we went to those agencies and we looked up their data, and that's how we managed to get so many grant applications that we so that we knew the success rate by gender. So these are the agencies that are, several in Canada, the big ones are in the US, and quite a few are in Europe. Outside of those, there are very few. By the by, since so many people study things like the NIH or the UK Research Institute, there'll be several studies. If there's several studies on the same applications, we don't double count them. And then we kind of looked, how do they differ by country, by field, by year, by career stage? What we found was the main difference was by country. Okay, so what did we see? So this is, this picture that shows you the gender difference. The slight line in the middle is 0, no gender difference. Things to the left are give advantage to males. Things to the right give advantage to females. What we found is that the majority of studies, as you can see here, show no significant difference. The average difference, the average gender gap in grant success rates, if you apply what is your likelihood to succeed, is a slight but insignificant female advantage. Yes, advantage. And, frankly, I think kudos to the NSF and the NIH, who are the bulk of these US1 grant applications submission. Because if you take a look, here's the NSF, the whatever colored brownish red. This is the NSF. And you can see that throughout the whole period from 2000 on, pretty much the solid line was above the dotted line. The solid line is women's success rates. These are success rates. Here's the NIH research program grants all together. In the beginning, the dotted line was above, but no longer, which is to say, since this period, for sure, women had equal success rates to men. And if you separate that out into two things, these are the bulk of it, are NIH R01s of the bulk of the research grants. And R01s type 1 are, here's a new project. R01 type 2 is a renewal project. Where we see there was a big gap is in the R01 type 2. In R01 type 1s, there was a slight gap in the beginning, but after that, it's, and at the end, it's clearly advantage, if anything, towards women. So there was one here. Now, I would have expected a gap there because, in fact, women are less likely to be productive in their original R01. They were less likely to publish. And there are a lot of, reasons, and you can look at our paper. But what I think is amazing is that now the renewals have the same percentage of success rates between men and women. I think it's amazing. And what I think it says is the women, I think what's happening is that the women are actually getting that those extra publications out of their original R01s. It could be affirmative action, who knows, but I don't think so, or lack of bias, whatever. I'd like to think that the women are managing to publish more, are kind of figuring out the game that to have to publish more. Having said that, many of you are in Canada. Canada, I don't want to swear, but it doesn't do well. If here's the United States, positive is advantage to female. Here is Canada. So Canada, definitely, and in Europe somewhat as well. And in other, so overall in non-US, overall, there is a male advantage in success rates per se. Could be because of different previous records, that the people reviewing it know about, could be. But this is something to be concerned about and something that you would want to kind of turn to. The third topic is teacher ratings. This is kind of, people think, oh, the men are like the sage on the stage, it's called, and the women teachers are coaches. So which one do students like better? Well, there's been many good meta-studies of this, which themselves cover up to more than 100 studies about teaching ratings. And then there's Rate My Professor, which is millions and millions, 8 million, the article on that. So what do we find here? We find male advantages, like for instance, in Rate My Professor of 1/10 of a standard deviation. There's also some natural experiments in the sense of having the course assignment and teacher being exogenous so that you didn't choose who you got, a male and a female. That too, all of them, and then things differ by field by how they do it. But on average, people find between a 0.1 and 0.5 standard deviation disadvantage for women in teaching evaluations. That's it. My favorite study among these is the one by McNeil that I haven't seen anything like it since, and I would encourage other people to do it. They had online courses that only had 43 students, which obviously we need a lot more, but they had online courses where they had exactly the same course and they had no interaction. You had no interaction that wasn't online. And people thought, okay, some people thought their professor was a Paul, and some people thought it was Paula. But they were actually randomly assigned to men and women. There was still a half a standard deviation difference. Students are biased against women professors. The fourth area is journal submissions. We did a meta study of 410 journal submissions. And then after we closed our meta study, there's this person named, I gotta get it right, Flaminio Squazzoni from Milano, and these other co-authors did this incredible, got this incredible data set from 145 journals of more than about 350,000 submissions of journals, journal articles. What did they find? Before I show you what they find, I want to say I just looked up the Google sites to Squazzoni. Nobody knows about this article. Why don't people know about it? I'm telling you so you know about it at least. It's an incredible trove of information on 145 journals. This summarizes their finding. This is their graph. Let me just explain it a bit to you. This is the proportion, the rates. The first bar is reject rates. The second bar for each of these is accept rates. For four different kind of broad fields is how do you categorize an article if it has more than one author? So what most people do, what we did in ours, is to look at more than one way of categorizing. You could use the first author. Is the first author a woman? Is the last author a woman? Is the corresponding author a woman? Usually the corresponding is one of the other two, so you're covered in any sense. What did they find? So the female, you have a female advantage. This is, the yellow is women. So if the accept bars are higher than the reject bars for women, that means there's a female advantage. So there's a female advantage of journal submissions getting accepted in biomedicine and health sciences. There is a female advantage of journal submissions getting accepted in physical science. Here, I can't actually see the difference, so I didn't circle it, although I believe there is also a female advantage in last author. And there's a female advantage in articles getting accepted in social science and humanities. This is conditional on nothing. I just want to make sure. So we did a little conditioning on this and that. The only area here is life science besides biomedicine, where there is a male advantage. And you will also notice that none of these are very big advantages or disadvantages. In our study, we had 410 journal acceptances. We did find a bias against women. Now, why are we different than Squazzoni? If you ask me, it's because we started in 2000. Theirs is from 2010 to 2016. Over time, it's gotten better. So things have improved over time. We found that. So there was over the whole period a male advantage, and the scientific fields differed. And just to mention my favorite one more time, economics and physical science were the worst. And just to mention about this literature, there's some evidence that double-blind reviewing gives women an advantage, more of an advantage, but not a lot. So that would suggest that it was biased to begin with, but it's very limited information. And there's some evidence that if you can get the people to focus, the reviewers to focus on there's some evidence that if you control for the individual characteristics of the author, that you know beforehand, before the article, that goes away. This is a picture from our meta-analysis showing that here is 0. as in before, 0 is always the kind of the biggest thing, the biggest difference, which is to say the fact that there is very little gender difference. This is salary. There's a salary pay gap, right? The AAUP, the American Association of University Professors, collects data on salary, and they kind of headline for 18% gender gap in salary. Women get paid less. And we agree that women get paid less. However, it's not 18% less if you compare similar men and women. So most of that 18%, even in their data, they hide this inside, is that it wants you control for rank and for institution type, like is it a BA institution, a research institution? It goes, the gender gap falls a lot. Here it becomes less than 3% among full professors in BA institutions and 11% in the research PhD. And this is only controlling for rank and type of institution, not for other things, particularly not for how old you are, how long your career has been. So I did an analysis using NSF data of the SDR, the survey of doctorate recipients. I too got around 18% without controlling for anything. But if you just control for kind of the things they did, but also for how long it's been since you got your PhD, so how many years of experience you have, it goes all the way down to 6.9%. Neither of these control for productivity. If you think that people should get paid more if they're better at research or better at teaching, we aren't capturing that. Now, I have another favorite article, this about salary, is this one by Liam Cadell. They have more than 100 citations, but not all that much more than, So they looked at public universities, which have to publicize their salaries. They looked at 40 different universities and 6 different kinds of departments in 2017. And what did they find? Okay, this is the gender gap in salary. It's out of average salaries of a little bit more than $100,000 in 2017. So, and this converts it to 92%. Like everybody else, they found here a 19% gender gap in salaries on average. They did control here for race because they are focusing on race and gender. But now if they, FE is for fixed effects, there are dummy variables for each university. If you control for that, it goes down a little. What really changes it is controlling for fields. Scientific fields, this is not just science, scientific fields pay more. Supply and demand say there's more of a demand outside the university, and they have to pay more in order to attract academics. And that's a huge part of the reason that there is a gender gap. PhD rank doesn't make such a difference. Experience, as I said, the older, how many years are you not supposed to get raises every year? You do get raises every year. And just because of that, it falls all the way to 6%. If you further control for productivity, this is research only, it'd be nice to have teaching, but nobody has that data. If you further control for research productivity, the gender gap in salary is less than 3%. So women are less likely to be in high-paying fields. They're less likely to have been there for 20 and 30 and 40 years. Those things are true. They're also a little bit less likely to be productive. But there's very little salary gap of what we would see as similar men and women along those dimensions. I also, to say myself, with my colleague Donna Ginther, we studied some really cool academic analytics data. We're interested in economics, so we got this article published about the tenure rates. We didn't do a meta-analysis of tenure. I have looked at tenure, but we got tired. I particularly got tired of doing the meta-analyses. I said, no more. let's just stop here. But by the by, this is a mega study of lots and lots of different universities that are all give their data to academic analytics. I know BU does, but thousands, hundreds of universities in the US do. This, and we looked at how likely are you to get tenure, receive tenure. We used a hazard survival model because that's what you want to do. You want to say how likely, kind of combine how likely are you and how long does it take for you to have tenure. Here, anything that would be, 1 is gender equality, less than 1 is disadvantage for women. You do see a disadvantage here, and that kind of parallels this disadvantage in salary, I think. But it's a relatively small and definitely insignificant disadvantage for most fields with standard errors of like 0.05. So definitely these are not significant at standard levels, but they are all less than 1. Economics stands out. Economics, once again, is the worst. Okay. Our 6th thing that we looked at, and ones that psychologists might be particularly interested in, is letters of recommendation. Everyone says letters written for women are worse because, you know, and they have fewer standouts. They have more like kind of communal things, and they have more, oh, this person works hard as opposed to this person stands out, and they have more doubt raisers, etc. So once again, we kind of did a meta-analysis looking for all the articles. These are the articles that we found. They don't have the same thing that they study. So some of them study some of these, some of them study others. They are ordered here, not by year, but by how big is the sample. So this is more than 200, and this is more than 2,000. So this, as you go towards here, this is also the latest of these. Black says there's no gender difference. Obviously, there's more Black in this picture than anything else. Genders are the same along all those dimensions in all of those studies. Red means there's an advantage to men. This one, the earliest one, 2003, more advantage to men than later ones for sure. But in the later ones, what do we see? We see a mixture, and the largest one here has advantage for women on some dimension and advantage for advantage for women. The red is advantage for men. The advantage for men, this is a negative thing on some dimension. So it's a mixed bag there, but on average, you'd have to say there's no systematic gender differences where women get worse letters. So our overall conclusion is there's no average gender bias against women in STEM, tenure-track hiring, U.S. grant success, journal evaluation, recommendation letters for those in these tenure-track careers. There is bias in non-U.S. grant success. There is bias in teaching evaluations, and there is bias in salary and tenure. But the salary different, kind of gap is much smaller than the 18% usually. But I think another big lesson is you can't generalize to everybody. You can't generalize from one country to the next. You can't generalize from one field to the next. And certainly you can't generalize from economics to any other field because we are the worst. Can we make any generalizations at all? Well, I think there's clearly something that we see over and over again. Women are less likely to apply. They're less likely to apply to our tenure-track jobs. They're less likely to apply for grants. They're less likely to resubmit applications that get turned down or to ask for renewals of previous grants. And we didn't do this, but from other literature, we think that women are probably less likely to get competing offers in order to raise their salary. So we have to understand why women are not applying for all of these things. A second general finding, I think, is that if you look at which ones, when there is no gender bias, it's very clear to us what an article by Koch et al. Found among workforce in general in employment decision making, that evaluations are more gender fair when the criteria for excellence are more explicit and the evaluators really want to make the right choice. And so in tenure track hiring, the faculty hire them really, that's going to be their colleagues. They want to make the right choice. And also the criteria of who would be a good college, a good academic is clearer. As opposed to that a Master-Cusin article, which was about hiring a lab manager from a student who won't be there that long after all, and where the criteria are not clear. That's just one example of why, when it is that more explicit criteria means more gender fair. And there's also studies in grants that say when you focus on the grant itself, and it's very clear what you want to, it's going to be less gender. And frankly, from the study I mentioned, tenure rates by Mia and by myself and Donna Ginther, we also found this in economics, which is to say, if you look at the hazard rate, the gender bias and the likelihood of tenure or the gender difference, among the universities that are really research universities, so this is the Carnegie Regi of very high research universities, it's not so bad in economics, but it's horribly unequal in the less research intensive universities, where what are you giving them tenure based on if it's not on their research? What else is important for, it's not as clear, the criteria are not as clear. And you also see that huge gap in physical science. Surprisingly, you don't see it. You see it, if anything, going the other way, although these differences most of these are not significant. So there's two more things I want to do before I leave. Just a few minutes. What's the advantage of noticing when there's no gender bias? Why do we bother? Why should we publish this article? Because we would like people to say, look, there's no gender bias here, but here there is. And we would like the efforts to be pinpointed to where the real reason for underrepresentation, which I'll talk about in a second, and focus the answer, focus your efforts to where there is bias. And also, we think this might encourage more women to go into science if they know it's more gender fair than they expected. And also might encourage universities and funding agencies saying, good for you, kudos to you. Some takeaways we hope is that everybody has to do a much better job of verifying facts. Don't depend that other people have looked at the literature. Don't depend on other people's summary of the evidence. And finally, we think that our adversarial collaboration worked really well. We each said, but you weren't thinking about this. And so we think that it's a good idea for journals and authors to do that. So what implications are there? And I'd like to say, don't stop worrying about underrepresentation of women in science. It is still a problem, as you saw. You have to worry about why women are not applying for academic jobs. So if you look, there's literature on this, and it's pretty clear that if you surveys of women say, I want a family, I don't think I can do it when I have, a long postdoc until I can get an academic job. And then I have to be very, very productive and by the time I get tenure, I'll be 40 and I won't be able to have babies maybe. Certainly won't be energetic enough to raise them. Yes, once again, we should worry about underrepresentation, but not just about whether women PhDs go on, but how did they get to be PhDs to begin with? It's because they majored in science and they liked it. How did we get to there? Why aren't there women majoring in science? The literature that we have summarized in our previous article is that choices are made for sure by the end of high school of interest, hard to change them, possible, but hard to change them afterwards. And particularly around the puberty, around middle school, you got to get girls' interests in science, and that's the way to raise that representation. Another couple of do nots before I leave. Don't assume that this applies to race. We didn't study race. Guess why? There's not a lot of studies on race. That's horrible. That's the problem. Why aren't there enough studies? There aren't enough minority academics. For whatever reason, whenever that starts, whenever they start being underrepresented, we should do something about that. Also, don't stop monitoring these things. Keep it. Yes, we improved from the 1990s, but if we improved, we could backslide. And look for where the problem is, and that's where you want to look at. Economics has a problem. I've heard that philosophy has a problem. There's not a lot of evidence, could be studied much more. Do not think that we can ignore sexual harassment. Sexual harassment is not something where it's hidden. People don't know it. It happens, and you have to monitor it, make sure it doesn't happen, do something if you find out about it. And economics has a particular problem in it with sexual harassment. The Nobel Prize winner, a recent Nobel Prize winner, was kind of guilty of it, among others. So the last thing I want to talk about is lessons for researchers. Bias is sexy. Bias sells. You saw how many people are writing about it. But as you look at the literature, it becomes increasingly clear to us that people are playing this game called find the bias. Because if you find the bias, you get your articles published, which is a little bit like finding Waldo and Where's Waldo. So I saw instances of seeing the same paper twice. It didn't get published the first time. The second time, you next met the paper, and the first time it didn't find any gender bias. In the second one, it said, oh, look, there's homophily or these other little things that are gender biased. In other words, gender bias gets published, and people are writing to that, are looking for where is that gender bias. Don't keep citing whatever. This is a lesson for you guys as researchers. Just don't do what everybody else cites. Do your own literature review. And as reviewers and editors, don't just accept articles if they find bias. Also accept them if they find no bias. No bias is an important, result. And we ourselves should not just say, oh, found no bias, let me move on to my next project. And finally, let me say, maybe we should be looking more at other bias or gender or harassment or racial bias or something else. Like I'm looking at immigration and stuff, because there's too much written and that's not finding anything. And the reason all this is important to me is that when you only see bias, you'll end up battling windmills that aren't there rather than the real enemies. So that's what I think, that's what we think, and I'm happy to get this opportunity to share. And I shall stop sharing.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Kahn, for sharing your very evidence-based perspective here. And I appreciate looking at all the data and understanding the nuances. I wanted to let the people in the audience know that at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A button. And so please post any comments or questions you have for Dr. Kahn below at the Q&A button. Please don't use the chat feature. So in Zoom webinar, the Q&A button is the way that the panel, Dr. Kahn and I can take a look at the questions. So just to give people a couple minutes to think about and post some questions, I want to start the first two questions myself. That's okay. So Dr. Kahn, what really sparked you to do this project? In other words, what got your interest? Of all the particular reviews or research studies you can do out there, why did this take your time?
Really, to tell you the truth, Steve and Wendy called me and they said, we want to do this thing. Look at all these people who are claiming that there's gender bias when there isn't. And I had fun working with them the first time. I thought they were really interesting. And I too kind of look at all these articles. It makes me a little angry when articles really look for gender bias. How can we find it if it's not obvious? Because it's going to get published. So it's ironic. I just want to say, in the 1990s in ancient history, I wrote one of my first articles about women and gender about economists and in academia and gender. And I got it rejected. And the answer is, oh, we've published a lot of articles about women lately. That's enough. And it's so different than what it is now. Now, you say the word bias and you get published. So I guess I feel that it's too much already. Article after bias. The real bias, as I said, the real problem is getting women interested in science and into academia. The real problem is finding a way, the systemic problem of the tenure-track system and figuring out alternatives. That's a real problem I want us to focus on. So.
Okay, great. And the second question that I have is, since it's been published, have you got any, I guess, ultimately though, I guess one of the take-home messages I got from your study was that the picture is much more nuanced. And it's important to kind of recognize the areas in which there's little evidence of bias or lack of bias, and areas in which there is bias, and not paint it with a broad brush. But I think a lot of the perspective looks at the situation much more uniformly and homogeneously across all domains, all examples. And so my thought is, have you gotten any pushback, or are people just not interested because it kind of what they believe? But have you gotten any sort of negative response or reactions to your research study or sharing these ideas?
I don't want to say where we got negative responses, but we did get some negative responses from people who think that we're kind of selling out women. Not necessarily that they say, but I'm not going to talk about, point fingers at journals or publications or anything, but just to say we have gotten some pushback, some people who don't want to write about this article because they think it's misleading, or they don't want, I don't know, they think it's misleading, I guess. So we have that. We also have a lot of people saying, which I don't think is the right thing, oh, now we can get rid of all of these diversity and equity initiatives on campus. And as I said, particularly for underrepresented minorities, we haven't found that at all. We haven't looked for it enough, but it doesn't seem to be true for underrepresented minorities for sure.
Okay, great. Well, going to the audience here, the first response is just a comment. Truly an insightful session. Thank you so much for taking up this issue and clearing up the misrepresentations as well as ignorance of the intersectionality in much of gender bias related literature and academics. So thank you so much for that comment.
Thank you very much, Ashby.
Great. So let me come up with another question here then for you. The next question is, how can we get individuals to, how can we get individuals to more thoughtfully investigate the literature themselves with gender bias? I guess it relates to the point that you mentioned that people just cite other people's sites and don't actually go and look at the literature themselves. So.
Yeah, well, one of the things is that we here are trying to tell people, guys, go do your own literature searches. We hope that there's more of that. So, but how do you get people to do it? I think also is when you're writing referee reports or as an editor, when you're reviewing articles, you have to say, well, have you done a complete review of the literature about this? Because I believe there are other things out there. I don't know. Otherwise, I don't. I mean, it does take time to do literature reviews, but I don't understand when people present articles and others say, but that was done 5 years ago by so and so. How could they not know that? Do you know? How could they not have? I mean, and was published then. So just tell them. I don't know. We've got to have the journals do it. We've got to have colleagues do it. And we have to have articles like this because otherwise, people are lazy.
Great. The next question, what do you believe are the most important next studies to conduct in this area? So I'll turn that over to you. What research needs to be done?
Oh God, that's really good. First of all, I would love to see more done on race because race is such a problem. Race and science. I would, in terms of, I'd love that teaching experiment. I would love to see more experiments like the McNeil one where, of really looking at gender bias. Let's see, where else is there really missing, really missing stuff? Right now, I can't think of that much that's missing. So I can't think of that much that's missing. Okay. Wait a second, I thought of one more. If there was some way to look to see how, and a little bit has been done, how teaching evaluations affect salary, that would be really nice to know. Because if there's bias against women in teaching evaluations, how much does that affect salary? That would be really nice to know. That's something else you might want to do, I would say.
Great, okay. Next question is, do you know the gender of the individuals who do the research that finds the lack of gender bias? It seems that if a man comes up with these findings, maybe less accepted than if a woman conducted the same study. I fear that I'm unable to conduct this type of research because I am a man.
Oh, that's really funny because I have lots of colleagues. I know lots of people who are men who do these studies. I don't want to call out people, but there are a lot of men who do these studies in economics, at least, for sure. And but yeah, if you read this, if you look at the literature review and look up, some of them are women and some of them are men. And I'd rather have the men do it because they have a little bit less invested in it, and so they might be a little bit more, more even-handed. But there are a lot of men doing it. If you think you don't, if there aren't, there are.
Great. Okay. The next question is, I'm curious how changes in gender identity and fluidity is expected to change some of the literature and work in this field.
Say that again. They're curious about how.
I'm curious how changes in gender identity and fluidity is expected to change some of the literature and work in this field.
What's going to take time for that to kind of percolate up to the academic, to the faculty level. But as I said, there was one study, I saw the one about one study that did look and found that non-binary gender also kind of was similar to women in some ways. But it will take time because you have to be out long enough, you have to be non-gender long enough. So it will take time for that to really kind of percolate up and get enough data on it. And, there's only now that people are collecting data on gender where it's not male, female. And you need to have it not male, female in order to measure what is happening. But I think that as people, as everybody, like from the census on down, collects that data, it will be happening in the next 10 years for sure.
Great. And again, for the audience, please try to use the Q&A function and not the chat feature when you post your questions. If you use the Q&A feature, Dr. Kahn also gets to see the question on her screen. as opposed to the Q&A feature, as opposed to the text messaging feature though. And the Q&A button is at the bottom of your screen. And so please utilize that. Another question has popped up here, or a comment. Apologies, I came a bit late, so you may have mentioned this earlier in the talk. Was there any data on the field of engineering? So I guess there was, so I guess there's an opportunity to kind of review and refresh
so there wasn't all that much that I talked about where I separated out engineering, but I will say that engineering is one. I've done some research, actually, not on engineering in the academia per se, but as engineering graduates and what their careers are like, and women versus men. And what happens, well, once again, the problem is the scheduling of children, and that affects the career somewhat. But in terms, I can look at separately, but in terms of the kind of more mathematical fields, including engineering, and we did see engineering early on in terms of tenure track. In the terms of tenure track hiring, there's definitely seems to be a bias towards hiring women so that they can get more women to teach and attract women students. So to the extent that that was done in hiring, I'm thinking about whether other engineering, but I don't think that engineering was like the other physical sciences in many cases. And in many cases, it was like other physical sciences, where in certain aspects there is affirmative action towards women because they want more and more women there. And I think, that's all I want to say. But a lot of the literature does include engineering, and engineering is it's not worse for sure. There's fewer women, but it's not worse in terms of being having these decisions biased against them.
Okay. Next question. Has any study controlled for the presumed? Also, I should make these live. Actually, everyone else can see the questions. I apologize. Has any? So
there are studies that look. There are some.
The question? Sorry, can I the question because the audience hasn't seen it yet. So, has any study controlled for the presumably greater teaching and service load of women faculty to see how that predicts lower productivity and salary of women?
So I should write your name down. There is some, and it can affect the obviously tenure decision and salary decision. It definitely can. And there has been some literature. It's a little mixed about how much it affects it, but if you send me an email, I'll tell you some. I'll write back a list of some articles you might want to look at. It does, it does seem to have an effect, a little effect in some aspects, but not as big as you would imagine. But perhaps that's because we don't have that much data on it. But I'm happy to send you this.
Great. Okay. So as we come towards the end of our time today, Dr. Kahn, I wanted to give you an opportunity for any closing thoughts or reactions or messages that you'd like to leave the audience with.
All I can say is thank you for listening to what we have to say. And I hope that you go out and you say, okay, now I'm going to really do a literature search every time I start a new topic. That would be one thing I'd love to see you all to walk out away from this. And just use this as a research and where to start your literature search.
Okay, I was going to end it there, but a question just popped up here again, and so we do have a few more minutes. So is it okay if we go back to a question just popped up here? It says, from personal experience and feedback to work you have done, what do you believe are the main driving forces perpetuating the belief that sexism in academic science is pervasive when, according to your work, this is not necessarily the case? Oh, actually, two questions posted by the speaker. So that's the first question. I'll read it out again. For personal experience and feedback to work you have done, what do you believe are main driving forces perpetuating the belief that sexism in academic science is pervasive when, according to your work, this is not necessarily the case?
Right. It's not that it's not there. It's that it's there some places, and that we've been more successful in getting rid of it in other places. But why? I will say that I think there's some confirmation bias of people thinking, of some women thinking that they perhaps that there was this, yeah, I guess this, I'm afraid to say this because I don't know how true this is, you know, that it's more salient to them. But there's a part of the question here saying, why is anything popular? I'll just talk about something else I'm doing. You don't have to know what it is. AKM models. I think it's a silly model in economics. Why are so many people doing it? I think that once it's kind of, it's self-fulfilling, you know, it builds on itself. If everybody's doing it, well, then it's getting published and everybody's interested in it and it's getting published and it's just kind of self-perpetuating. And I hope at some point people move to other things as well. That's all I can say.
Great. And the same individual had a second question in their comment. Thinking about COVID and how it has affected women and men in the field, I wonder if there are other types of gender bias that might be present should the literature include work from this period.
You know, it's interesting because as soon as COVID happened, all economists said, oh, great natural experiment, let's study COVID. So I'm sure it will be interesting to study COVID. And how did COVID affect women differently? It made it harder to be mothers because of daycare. And that is, you know, in general, because care of the children. And that's definitely could have an effect. And what will probably, it discourages women who are getting PhDs from going into academia because of the strict timeline. I'm guessing that that's one of the things that would happen. I'm not sure what else. But I would say that it's interesting in general to see what's going to happen with COVID. And it's a shame that it did hurt mothers much more, you know, and I bet you we do see some change in their careers, especially moving away from high-powered jobs or academic jobs because they weren't able to get daycare. I bet you we do see some of that.
Great. And one more comment popped up, and I'm gonna end it at this last comment here before we show it up. So I appreciate that people were asking questions right till the very end, but we have 2 minutes left on the clock. And the last comment is just a comment. The comment says, "Great work. Thank you for your thoughtful and brave research. It helps us understand the reality and changes over time better."
Thank you so much. And I hope I haven't offended anybody, not anybody who works in this and not anybody who works on AKM, which I shouldn't have mentioned, but in general, thanks for the interest.
Great. So with that said, Dr. Kahn, I really appreciate you taking the time and the energy to share with us your research study recently that is making waves and allowing us to understand how nuanced the perspective is, as well as your willingness to provide guidance for how we should move forward to better understand and do research in this area. So thank you again for participating in the Confronting Hegemonic Ideas in Counseling Psychology Speaker Series.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Great. And for the audience, this is the last series of the last speaker of the year. We really appreciate those who have supported us this year as well as in last year's series. So that's tuning off the series, but thank you again for your great support. All talks will be posted online where they've been posted before to the Dr. Betty's Research Teaching and Service Lab YouTube page. And so please do a search for it there. And there'll be information for those of you who agreed for a follow-up survey. I believe the information might be there as well. But you can always email me directly if you wish a link to the YouTube page. And I try to get this posted up within a week. So please, give it a week. And if you don't see it, let me know. But it should be posted up there within a week. Thank you again, Dr. Kahn, and thank you again to the audience members for their questions. That kept us busy right until the end of our time, which is 12:20 on the West Coast and 3:20 for Dr. Kahn on the East Coast of Canada or the United States. Thank you again, everybody. Hope you all have a wonderful day, evening, morning, whatever time zone you're in.